Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Raina MacIntyre is Professor of Global Biosecurity at the University of New South Wales and a National Health and Medical Research Council Research Fellow. Raina's vaccine expertise is in older adults and immunosuppressed people, including several clinical trials of vaccines in adults and transplant patients. She has been on the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Vaccine Compositional Technical Advisory Group and the SAGE Smallpox and Mpox Advisory Group. Raina is the author of Dark Winter, an insight into historical biological attacks, lab accidents, and epidemics, including the COVID-19 pandemic. Today I'm talking to Raina MacIntyre about her new book, Vaccination: Science, Reason, and the Threat to 200 Years of Progress. Raina MacIntyre, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Good afternoon.
You begin Vaccination with a rather disturbing anecdote on the subject of polio, and quite a confronting description of a life confined to an iron lung. Why did you start this book with polio?
So I wanted to remind people of the history of vaccine-preventable diseases, and I think polio resonates with people. They know that people got paralyzed from polio. Many people do have that recollection, or not, maybe not a personal recollection if they're younger, but have heard of iron lungs and seen those photographs. So I really wanted to frame it in history of what we've conquered with vaccines, and polio was really a big story in terms of conquering vaccine-preventable diseases. For the small percentage of people who got paralyzed by polio, it meant also that potentially their respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, was also paralyzed. And if your diaphragm's not working, you can't breathe because you need it to expand the lungs and to breathe. So the iron lung was a machine that they used in the 1950s to help people breathe for them. So they were put in this little submarine-like contraption with the head sticking out at the top and the rest of the body inside the machine. And the machine created negative and positive pressure, basically, to help the lungs to inflate and deflate.
Let's talk about the immune system. What is it and how does it work?
So the immune system is how our body gets rid of invaders, things that aren't meant to be there that enter our body. Our immune system fights it. And even as simple as a scratch on your skin, the inflammation that you see and the scar and everything that forms after that is the immune system reacting to protect you from that scratch. So in our blood, we have white cells and red cells. The red cells are what carry hemoglobin and they hold the oxygen in our red blood cells. And then we have the white cells, which are immune cells. So they're broken down into B cells and T cells. T cells and B cells are made in the thymus, which is in your neck, near your thyroid gland. And that is one of the important immune organs in the body, and that produces those cells as well as our bone marrow. And the B cells produce antibodies. So if you get an infection like measles, there'll be antibodies produced by the B cells that can directly kill the measles virus. The T cells, on the other hand, have what's called cell-mediated immunity, which is more releasing various proteins. So not antibodies that directly kill. Think of the B cells like gunfire, where you just shoot and kill the invader. The T cells produce these proteins that kind of create signals. They're a bit more like chemicals. So it's a bit more like chemical warfare that attacks the invaders in a different way to also kill them. And those two arms of the immune function work together. Vaccines will stimulate both, the T and the B cell response. It's the B cell response that commercial tests can measure easily. The T cell response is more specialized testing that is not as easy for your GP to do. That happens more in a research environment, but we know that the T cell function is also stimulated by vaccines.
What supports the immune system and what compromises the immune system?
So the immune system is supported by your general health and nutrition. Certain nutritional deficiencies can make your immune system dysfunctional. For example, zinc. We know that zinc has an important role in immunity, and some of those over-the-counter supplements you can get that for immune function have zinc in them commonly. But the other thing that can compromise immunity is illness or medication. So sometimes if you get a viral infection, your immune system will be transiently disrupted and won't be able to respond as well. That's why they say if you've had a recent febrile illness to wait till you've recovered before getting a vaccination. So your GP usually won't vaccinate you if you've just had a viral infection. They'll wait a bit. The other thing that can disrupt the immune system is medications, like cancer drugs or drugs for autoimmune diseases like corticosteroids, etc. So there's a whole range of medical treatments that can also reduce your immune function. Certain infections can actually affect your immunity. HIV obviously affects your ability to particularly mount a T-cell response. But also COVID-19 also causes a range of immune dysfunction that looks like it makes you more vulnerable to other infections. And that may be why we're seeing a rise in all these other infections now. And then a vaccine is like something that can give you that boosted immunity to a particular target or disease that helps you fight it off without actually getting the infection.
How do vaccines work?
The vaccines work by tricking your body into thinking you've encountered that virus or that bacteria. You haven't actually encountered the pathogen. You've just had a vaccine, which is usually a part of that virus or bacteria, a harmless part given in a harmless form, where your body will recognize that part of the virus or the bacteria and create antibodies to it and memory to it. But you won't get sick. I mean, you won't get sick like getting the infection. Yes, you might get a sore arm, you might get fever, but you're not going to get the same kind of illness that the virus would otherwise give you. And then within usually a period of 2 to 4 weeks, you've mounted an immune response. Depending on the disease and the vaccine, sometimes you need 2 or 3 vaccines in a primary series, and the primary series is what's needed to establish that baseline immunity. And then for some diseases, you might need a booster every number of years or in a specified period of time, depending on the disease. Because typically that first dose of the vaccine will see a big rise and a peak in the immune function, in the antibodies, but then they'll start to drop off pretty quickly. You give a second dose and you see a much bigger peak that stays high for much longer. And that's the principle of, the childhood vaccines like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. Babies get 1, 2, 3 doses in rapid succession. That's the principle of that you're triggering that longer term immunity that'll be more sustained. It'll stay, those levels will stay up for longer.
And I suppose this is why ongoing COVID-19 vaccinations are recommended.
That's right. And unfortunately with COVID-19, the virus itself mutates pretty rapidly, and the vaccines are made against particular variants of the virus. And the time to get through the regulatory frameworks and all the processes needed, by the time the vaccine's ready, that virus is gone, and there's a new mutation running around. And the vaccine will give you some protection, but not as good as it would have against the original virus for which it was designed against. So that's one issue, but also with the COVID vaccines, the immunity wanes between 3 to 6 months, which is common with RNA viruses, particularly like influenza is the same. That's why you need a new influenza vaccine every year, also because it mutates rapidly. So getting those boosters is really important. The protection against death and hospitalization persists for much longer than against infection for the COVID vaccines. But if you haven't had a booster for 3 or 4 years, then your protection against dying from COVID and going to hospital starts to reduce as well.
Bacterial infection versus viral infection. Do vaccines work in both cases, and do they work differently?
They do. So bacteria are much larger, more complex organisms than viruses. A bacteria is a multicellular organism, and they're defined by how they stain under a microscope. They can be gram-negative or gram-positive. They can have a capsule around them. Some of them have a little tail called a flagella. So there's lots of different kinds of bacteria, and we do have bacterial vaccines. We've got vaccines against tuberculosis, which is a bacteria, against pneumococcal disease, which is the commonest cause of bacterial pneumonia, against Haemophilus influenza, which is a common cause of bacterial meningitis, and also against meningococcal meningitis, which is also a bacterial infection. So there are plenty of bacterial vaccines, and whooping cough as well, which is also a bacterial infection. Viruses are much smaller organisms, and they need to live inside a cell. They need a living cell, such as a human cell, in which to replicate, whereas bacteria exist outside of the cells. They travel in the bloodstream, etc., whereas a virus needs that human cell to get into. So first of all, it invades the cell and replicates inside the cell and then spreads through the body in that same process. Think of it, if you saw that movie Aliens, think of it like that. The virus is like the alien and if your body is a cell, gets in the cell, multiplies, kills the cells, and does a lot of damage.
Evidence for the effectiveness of vaccines is very strong, but vaccines do come with risks, and to address that issue, you introduce us to a thing called the risk-benefit equation.
So vaccines are a medical intervention like drugs, okay? There's no drug or vaccine in the world that is 100% safe or 100% effective. Every single drug has rare but potentially serious side effects, and the way that these things reach licensure and registration is through demonstration of safety. Part of that is assessing the risk-benefit equation. What's the risk of the disease, and what's the risk of the vaccine, and does the risk of the disease vastly outweigh the risk of the vaccine? And that's generally the formula that has to be shown for vaccines or drugs to be marketed. And when we talk about vaccine side effects, a really common side effect might be 10% or more. But rare side effects might be 0.001% or less. For many of these vaccines, there are serious but very rare side effects. And a good example I've pointed out in the book is smallpox vaccines. So smallpox vaccines do have some serious side effects. They're relatively rare, but they're serious. And after 9/11 in the US, they started doing general vaccination programs in civilians as well as military. And of course, there was no smallpox in the world at the time, but there'd been this anthrax attack following 9/11. So they were worried about biological warfare, worried about smallpox. And it quickly became apparent that there was a rate of myocarditis and pericarditis, particularly at a higher level than with COVID vaccines, and some other rare side effects that are potentially fatal from that vaccine. Now, if smallpox were to emerge and 30% of people would die of smallpox, which is like astronomical compared to anything we've known since then the risk of the disease vastly outweighs the risk of the vaccine, and it will be a no-brainer to use the vaccine. But if there's no smallpox, the vaccine risk is not acceptable. You look at the context. How common is the disease? How serious is the disease? And how do the risk of the vaccine stack up against the risk of the disease? And there are strict processes and protocols for doing that in most countries.
Let's talk about another equation. It's the prevention versus cure equation. What's harder to come by, prevention or cure?
Prevention is hard because success in prevention is nothing happens, right? It's not like, oh, I rescued this person who had this tragic accident and now they're alive, because I gave them surgery or whatever, right? Where you've got visible, tangible benefits and effects from an acute illness where you've got a treatment and you cure someone or you fix whatever's wrong. That's very tangible. Whereas you're vaccinating someone against cervical cancer, they may or may not have got cervical cancer, and it may not occur for another 20 or 30 or 40 years. So success in prevention is when nothing happens. And that's much harder to communicate and to resonate with people. As they say, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So most people would go for, just fix my broken leg after the car accident or take out my cancer. They'd value that more highly than having a vaccine to prevent that thing, which may or may not happen to every person.
Its success is invisible in a sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Fake news, immunisation myths, misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, worst case scenarios, and the whole anti-vaccine movement. These are just some of the things that good science and 200 years of progress must contend with. What's been the impact of these things, particularly on the anti-vaccine movement and on the uptake of vaccines and public health in general?
So the anti-vaccine movement has always been there. You know, Edward Jenner is credited with discovering the smallpox vaccine, and even when those vaccines started to be being used, there were anti-vaccination cartoons showing people turning into cows because the vaccine is made from cowpox, and so on. So anti-vaccination is as old as vaccines are. What's happened since the COVID pandemic is there's been just a globalization and a rise in disinformation, around vaccines. And I think partly it's because COVID is the first time since the eradication of smallpox that we've had a vaccination program for everybody. Prior to that, for 50 years, we've had vaccination for infants, children, and older people, some people in risk groups in between, but generally healthy adults didn't need any vaccines, right? Unless they chose to get a flu vaccine. So for the first time in most people's living memory, we needed a vaccine for everybody. And there were mandates, there were certificates required to attend certain places like hospitals or cinemas or workplaces, to board an airline even at some point. So I think that was kind of a new experience for a lot of people. There was a lot of resistance to all public health measures, particularly lockdowns, which also became conflated with all other public health measures, including vaccines, masks, etc. So we saw this big pushback, and then we saw kind of revisionist history and minimization of COVID and kind of disinformation around side effects, and particularly around the mRNA vaccines. It's also affected the medical community, and I've seen it firsthand. It's so hard to separate fact from fiction in terms of what's out there, including pseudoscientific medical journals that have popped up everywhere with their own, pseudoscientific publications. There's just such a flood of information, and it's very hard even for medical professionals to distinguish fact from fiction.
And have there been regional differences in the uptake of misinformation, disinformation, pseudoscience, Australia compared to the US, compared to the UK or parts of Asia, for example?
So I think the US and the UK have their own unique cultures where they're very susceptible to disinformation. Whereas in Australia, yes, of course, we're susceptible to disinformation, but our culture is much more accepting of public health and public health measures. We saw that during the pandemic. We achieved some of the highest rates of COVID vaccination in the whole world. Close to 95% of adults got their 2 doses. And that's way higher than most other countries achieved. So that's another reason, especially for Australia, we've got a lot to protect. We've had such a good history of public health and disease control in this country in many ways, not just through vaccines, but also, being an island nation, we've had biosecurity and quarantine measures that have protected us from things that other countries have suffered from, including the 1918 flu pandemic. We delayed its entry into Australia for almost a year by quarantining the ships and not allowing ships to come in. And that, by the time it did arrive in Australia, it was actually milder. It wasn't as severe as it had been in the first waves in other countries. So we've got quite a unique culture and a unique geography that means that we can do quite well if there's another pandemic. But, all that is kind of under threat with the rise in disinformation.
It also seems to me that a well-functioning health system might play its part in the future.
Yes, well-functioning health system is key, both baseline functioning and the ability to surge the capacity when needed. Australia did really well in terms of surging ICU capacity. We increased our bed capacity by about 110% or something. You also need health systems that can adapt to changing circumstances. And we saw in Australia some novel solutions like using hotels and so on. But you also need staff and personnel, and protecting the personnel is part of that preparation, which I don't think a lot of countries didn't do so well there. And you need the resources put into stockpiling and preparation for pandemics, but also for resourcing things that are needed in the supply chain, and I think domestic manufacturing is key. Things like masks, we saw it in the US, we saw it in Australia. After the 2009 flu pandemic, we had some rise in domestic manufacturing. And then after that pandemic was over, it just all fell away. I think governments should think about supporting those kind of surge requirements, for medical equipment, for ventilators, for masks, for other oxygen, for things you'll need in an emergency, so that we're not just scrambling when something hits, but we've got a baseline capability. Manufacturing of vaccines is another key capability, and many countries don't have any vaccine manufacturing capability. We're really fortunate in that we've had vaccine manufacturing capability for a long time, and now we've had more investment in mRNA vaccine manufacturing capability, so that puts us in a good position.
COVID-19 won't be the last pandemic we experience. What are the most immediate threats, and is it even possible to look further into the future? For a start, your chapter titled The Spectre of H5N1 had me a little concerned.
Yeah, so I think H5N1 or avian flu in general is a likely contender, mainly because in the past, till the COVID pandemic, we had a particular pattern of peaks where you'd get poultry outbreaks and then you'd respond, and they generally cull the birds or kill them to control the outbreaks. And then it goes away, and you might get a few human cases while those outbreaks are going. Then it goes away and you don't see it, and then it comes back again. That's the kind of sporadic pattern that we saw from 1997 onwards. Then in 2020, this new variant of H5N1 called clade 2.3.4.4b emerged. And instead of going away, it's just successively increased and increased and increased its footprint everywhere in the world. The epicenter of avian flu used to be in Asia. It's now in the US, the Americas, and Europe. So the whole geography of it has changed. And we're seeing a huge range of wild animals and wild birds that are getting infected. Traditionally, it was just waterfowl, which is ducks, geese, and swans. These are the migratory and seriform birds that fly really, really long distances across continents and carry this virus. They infect the poultry in farms, etc. Traditionally, that was the route of spread of avian flu through the world, through the ducks, geese, and swans, what we call waterfowl. Now it's in over 100 other species of wild birds that have completely different flyways or, airline routes, if you like. So there's lots of other ways in which it can spread. And we're seeing spread into farmed animals like what's happened in the US. It's never been seen in cows before, but since the beginning of last year, we've seen this dairy farm outbreak that's just got worse and worse and worse. And basically, with the virus kind of everywhere now, in animals, it is a pandemic in animals and birds, you've got many more opportunities for mutations to arise between mixing of human influenza viruses and the avian influenza viruses. That can happen on farms, in people who handle poultry. It can also happen in pigs. Pigs have both human and bird-like receptors in their bodies, so they can do that genetic mutation all by themselves without the need for humans to mix with chickens. The statistical probability of a mutation arising that causes a pandemic is much higher now than it was 5 years ago, because this avian virus is just everywhere. It's even in small terrestrial animals like squirrels, foxes, coyotes, etc., which means it can infect domestic animals like cats and dogs. In fact, there have been infections of domestic cats. And so it can come into human households through other routes than through birds or cattle. And it's in the food chain. Scientists have gone and tested the milk on the supermarket shelves in the US, and more than 30% of samples in some studies have the H5N1 fragments in it. Obviously, pasteurized milk is safe to drink. It should kill any virus in it. But there is a big raw milk movement in the US as well. So there's people drinking a live virus.
I guess our saving grace is my next question. That's about research. Medical science is always pushing the frontiers. The mRNA vaccines appear to be at the forefront of vaccine research. Where are we now, and where is vaccine research heading? What are the possibilities?
So, the mRNA technology really is a breakthrough technology. And of course, Caitlin Carrico and Drew Weissman won the Nobel Prize for discovering how to use mRNA technology in therapeutics or vaccines. The mRNA is messenger ribonucleic acid. The building blocks of any life, whether it's a plant or an animal or a human, is DNA. DNA is much bigger than mRNA or RNA, but basically the mRNA, it's a messenger in that it's like computer code. In our cells, we have these things called ribosomes that are like protein factories. And the mRNA gives it the code and tells it what to make, and the ribosome then makes a protein. So you'd have mRNA telling you to make skin cells when you've cut your hand and you need to heal yourself. Ribosomes will create the proteins to make those skin cells. And it's the same with the vaccine. So if we have a protein-based vaccine, like the Novavax, for example, you're injected with the spike protein from the COVID virus to give you the immunity to the virus. But the mRNA gives the signal to the ribosome to produce that protein itself. So you're producing it in your cells from the ribosome. The breakthrough that Caitlin Carrico and Drew Weissman made was creating a stable form of mRNA. In her early research, she found that the mRNA was very unstable, and if you inject it, it would just get degraded and it wouldn't be able to function. Then they discovered that you could coat it in a lipid nanoparticle that made it much more stable. So they just give it a lipid envelope and then it can be used in therapeutics and be stable and can achieve the desired effects. But there's so many more applications of mRNA, including in regenerative medicine. So, some cells don't replicate. Like if you have your spinal cord injured or cut your spinal cord and you're paralyzed, those cells won't grow again, right? They're not replicating cells. Or if you have a stroke and part of your brain is dead from the stroke, those cells don't replicate and regenerate in the way the skin cells do, for example. So mRNA therapy is being researched for all those applications where you can give the body a signal, make the spinal cord cells, make the brain cells. There's cures for things we can't even imagine, not to mention genetic diseases, and that's already being used for certain genetic diseases. In some genetic diseases, the body is missing a particular enzyme or something, and it leads to, muscle wasting and weakness and death usually. But you can provide the signal with the mRNA to produce that protein and give those babies a normal survival. So regenerative medicine, genetic diseases, and also cancer treatment. Most of the companies that make mRNA vaccines are now working on personalized cancer vaccines as well as generalized cancer vaccines. The idea of a personalized cancer vaccine is it's tailored for your specific cancer. So they're making vaccines for melanoma, are using mRNA technology. And melanoma is really deadly because you don't need a big melanoma for it to be fatal. If they reach, the size of a pea or smaller, it's probably, metastasized and it's going to end up being a fatal cancer. But these drugs using mRNA technology are showing great promise in terms of treating and potentially preventing cancers. And some of the mRNA technologies have been paired with other cancer drugs. Like there's a very amazing cancer drug called Keytruda, which has shown really good results with the kind of cancers for which there's usually no hope of cure. And it's shown amazing results. So they're pairing Keytruda with mRNA vaccines for cancers. And I think we're only just seeing the beginning of this technology, and it's really going to have a big impact on our ability to tackle a whole range of different diseases.
There's a lot packed into this book. What do you want people to take from this book? What kind of people do you want to read it, and perhaps even change the minds of vaccine skeptics and deniers, as remote as that may seem?
So, it's written for lay people. I've written it in a way that should be accessible to lay people who are not medical experts or don't have the technical knowledge. But I'd also hope some of the medical community would read it as well. because, as I said, I think a lot of the disinformation is affecting medicine and the practice of medicine, and we're seeing it being spread by, prominent medical practitioners as well. Vaccine hesitancy and refusal is a spectrum. The people at the extreme end of it who just deny vaccination and don't want to have it, I don't think it's going to change their minds. And that's what the research shows. People who are outright vaccine refusers and think that vaccines are harmful and evil and whatever else, they are not going to change their minds. We've seen that in the US with an unvaccinated child who died of measles, where the parents were still anti-vaccination and wouldn't have got her vaccinated, which is really sad. But there's a much larger group of people who've been affected by disinformation, are not sure, they're not getting the answers they need from the medical profession or from health practitioners. And so that's called the vaccine hesitant group, which is a much larger group. And they are, I think, maybe the ones who'd benefit more from the book, because it addresses some of the specific myths and realities around vaccines and ways to think about risk and benefit and what the consequences would be of different decisions.
Raina, there's so much more to discover in this book, much more than we've been able to discuss today. But thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
It's a pleasure.
I've been talking to Raina MacIntyre about her new book, Vaccination: Science, Reason and the Threat to 200 Years of Progress. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.